Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala rasulihi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. So we begin our lesson with the first hadith of the chapter, which is in the second bab. So the first bab, as by way of recollection, bab fadl al-ilm, the chapter on the virtue of knowledge. So
Hmm.
this week we will cover the first major hadith. So you can see the hadith is in front of you, and it has a chapter heading. So after bab, you see the chapter heading. It is entire line by itself. Sometimes the chapter headings are more extensive, sometimes they're briefer. And then where you see hadathana, where it's highlighted, that's where the hadith begins. And
Hmm.
then it turns into bab, like where the next bab is, that's the next chapter. So you can see the structure of the hadith. In this particular printing, this is how it goes. You might have different printings and different manuscripts and different books that might have a different schematic, but the words will be the same. There should be a bab in there, there should be hadathana in there, and then there's the boundaries of the hadith should be very clear to all of you. So who wants to read today? Let's read line by line because we read the hadith last week. We can read line by line. So someone read the beginning. Sister, you want to read just Bab from Bab. Bismillah. Yeah, if you can you see? Okay, good. So that's in the title of the chapter is Man su'ila ilman wa huwa mushtaghilun fi hadithihi. If you follow along your sunnah.com or whatever English translation you're following, so the translation is Man su'ila ilman. Whoever su'ila is a past tense, passive tense. Su'ila, sa'ala is he asked, su'ila he was asked. Man su'ila ilman. Whoever was asked about knowledge. Man su'ila ilman. Babu man su'ila ilman. So the chapter is about being questioned with regards to anything that is a matter of ilm. Man su'ila ilman wa huwa mushtaghilun fi hadithihi. While he is mushtaghilun means to be occupied. Shaghala yashghulu. Ishtaghala means to be busy with something. So whoever is asked some knowledge while he is busy in speaking, fi hadithihi. Here hadith means speaking. So or when you speak hadatha, that's the word hadatha. So although there's a book of hadith, just this is Arabic. So you know from the context, you have to understand from the context what hadith means. It's not doesn't mean hadith like a prophetic report. Hadith or the speaking, he completes his speech or his speaking. Thumma ajaba sa'ila. And then that person should answer ajaba sa'ila, a sa'ila. He should answer the person who is questioning. So just keep that chapter heading in mind. We'll talk about it more after we read the hadith. So anyone online want to read the hadith? So from hadathana all the way to where the matan starts. We'll take that portion and then we'll read the rest of the hadith. Ibrahim, you want to read?
Just the Isnad, you mean the Sanad?
Yeah, from hadathana, just the son up until an-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
حدثنا محمد بن سنان قال حدثنا فليح
Fulayhun.
فليح.
Mhm.
Siman doesn't have a fatha on the line. Okay, فليح
Well,
وحدثني.
ours does, so it should be Fulay, but maybe
It
your manuscript doesn't.
doesn't
Word
have it.
Fulayh.
Okay. حدثني إبراهيم ابن منذر قال حدثنا محمد ابن. Here it has it فليح in the second
Okay.
book. قال حدثني أبي قال حدثني هلال بن علي عن عطاء بن ياسر عن أبي هريرة قال. Keep going.
Yeah,
قال بينما
بينما, just read the beginning, yeah.
قال بينما النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في مجلس يحدث القوم.
Okay, stop here. Okay. So حدثنا محمد ibn Sinan. So this is Bukhari speaking. حدثنا Muhammad ibn Sinan. So Bukhari relates this hadith from Muhammad ibn Sinan. قال حدثنا فليح. And he relates from Fulay. He says, Fulay reported this to us. So this is the beginning of this isnad. So this isnad, it goes from, well, it's always from Bukhari because we're reading the Sahih. Let me get my pen here. Muhammad ibn Sinan is the teacher of Bukhari, and he gets the hadith from Fulayh. And now there's a ha here. Then it says, وَحَدَّثَنِي Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir.
So what is the ha?
So the ha, who remembers what the ha is in class? When you see ha in isnad, it's a symbol for something. So
I know, but for what?
this is ha tahwil. Ha is tahwil. So this ha, if you in the isnad, is a symbol. Let me mark it separately, put a box around it. It stands for tahwil. Tahwil means to change. Hawwala yuhawwilu. So what that means is Bukhari now switching the isnad.
Okay.
So he begins with his isnad from his teacher Muhammad ibn Sinan, who gets the hadith from Fulayh. Ha, now he begins a different isnad. So a new isnad. So he says, Wa haddathani Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir. So he says, and Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir related to me. So which hadith? It's the same hadith, but he has two different isnads. So he's bringing isnad number 1 and isnad number 2 for the same hadith. So that's how you see the ha is very important in isnad. Ha is ha tahwil. So حدثنا محمد بن سنان قال حدثنا فليح ها وحدثني إبراهيم بن المنذر قال حدثنا محمد ibn فليح. And then Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir relates from Muhammad ibn Fulayh. قال حدثني أبي. And he relates from his father. He says, my father related to me. So who's the father? Fulayh. So Muhammad ibn Fulayh, when he says قال حدثني أبي, then you can see from his name. So in Arabic, Arabs hate to repeat themselves. It's very efficient language. So when you have Muhammad ibn Fulay, Muhammad the son of Fulay says, my father relates to me. Instead of saying Fulay, you just say Abi because within the name you have the name of the father. And then قال حدثني Hilal ibn Ali. And then he said Hilal ibn Ali relates to me, or related to me this report. From Ata ibn Yasar. From Ata ibn Yasar. An Abi Hurayrata. So then you have Abu Huraira. قال بينما النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في مجلس يحدث القوم. He says one day the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sitting in a majlis speaking to people. That's the beginning of the hadith here. Okay. And so let's do this not first, and then we'll get into the hadith and the chapter heading. So the isnad comes from Muhammad ibn Sinan, from Fulayh, and then a second isnad from Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir, from Muhammad ibn Fulayh, from his father Fulayh, from Hilal, from Ata, from Abu Huraira. So where did the first isnad connect to the second one? So try to look at that, figure that out. Fulayh, yeah, because it's obvious, right? Goes to Muhammad, the son of Fulayh, from Hilal. So if you write this out, let's see if we can write this out for you. It should be obvious, but in case you want to write it up, then it would be the same. Yes. Yeah. So this is how in Arabic you'll say it. So Fulayh. Now, where does it pick up from Fulayh? So if we put in the chart, let's put in a chart. So should I write in Arabic or English? I'll write in English because it's faster. I can write faster with English. Sorry. So you have Muhammad Well, how do you change the color of the ink? Let me see. Hold on. Okay, let's start here. Muhammad ibn Sinan. Okay, that's from Bukhari, right? Let me put Bukhari here. So I'll put B for Bukhari. So this is the first isnad. Muhammad ibn Sinan relates from who? Someone look at the hadith and tell me. From Fulayh, yes.
Right.
So from Fulayh. And then second hadith is from Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir, right? So Bukhari to Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir. He relates from Muhammad, the son of Fulayh, from Fulayh. So properly the way we should be writing this should be this way. Here, like this. Okay? Bukhari from Muhammad ibn Sinan from Fulayh. And the second isnad from Bukhari from Ibrahim from Muhammad from Fulayh. And after Fulayh, who is the narrator? Hilal. After Hilal,
Atta.
Ata. Good. And after Ata,
An Abi Hurairah.
then you have Abu Huraira. I'll put AH. So
So
this
three
is
people.
what the isnad looks like.
Oh,
That's the way it's written out. So you can see what's happening.
okay.
So there are two isnads. There's actually one isnad, but Bukhari relates it from two different teachers. So there's actually two different isnads here. But they join at Fulayh, and so in the beginning it's separate, and then from Fulayh onwards it is the same. So first question is, so let's look at the transmitter. Who are these transmitters? So the first question I want you to think about is, why does Bukhari do this? So one of the things, remember I told you about Bukhari, to understand Bukhari, you have to ask questions. You have to ask why again and again. So Bukhari will never do anything for no reason. There will always be a reason why he does things. So there are reasons why he's producing two. Does a typical hadith have two isnads? An average hadith, a typical hadith, does it have one isnad or two isnads? Generally, like the hadith that you read. Most hadith, what do you recall? Yeah, the default is have one isnad.
Yeah.
So rarely, like it's not like every teacher is relating from multiple isnads in the same hadith. It's always hadathana someone, hadathana, all the way back to the Prophet. So ha is just a marker for now you have a second isnad in the hadith. So let's look at, so there's a reason for that, but let's look at biographies now. So the first part of the hadith is looking at the biographies. And then, well, the first part is a sequence. We'll do that next. Let's do the biographies first of the isnad. That's your historical context. The second portion will be the chapter and the sequence of the chapter. And third, the matan or the hadith itself. So Muhammad ibn Sinan a was a hadith expert of Basra, one of the teachers of Bukhari. He died in the year 223. So he was reliable, generally reliable. So Yahya ibn Ma'in said about him, thiqatun ma'munun. He was someone who was trustworthy and he was protected. Abu Hatim al-Razi said saduq. Saduq is a term that's like thiqa is the highest term. Saduq is a term that's one grade lower, one or two grades lower. So he's generally reliable, but you can say not the strongest transmitter out there. So when that's the case, when you have a person whose authenticity as a reporter is not of the highest degree, that sometimes what hadith experts like Bukhari do, they bring another isnad just to support that isnad. So you have Muhammad ibn Sinan, and then the second teacher is Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir. Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir, his name was Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir ibn Abdullah ibn al-Mundhir al-Qurashi al-Hizami al-Madani. He was a hadith expert of Medina and student of Sufyan ibn Uyayna and many others. And he was a teacher of Bukhari. About him, if you read what people said about his grading, Abu Hatim also says Saduq. So he doesn't say thiqa for both of them. He says Saduq. So he is trustworthy, but not of the highest level. An-Nasa'i said about him, Laysa bihi ba'sun. There's no problem with him. So Laysa bihi ba'sun is a comment that betrays that he's generally acceptable. But if he's have the highest level, the comment would be thiqa, trustworthy, or imam, or hujjah, or something like that. So you can tell also from Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir, he's not the strongest reporter. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, for instance, he didn't approve of him. There's some reports that he didn't sit with him and he refused to admit him to his teaching classes and things like that. So Ibrahim ibn al-Mundhir is even lower on the scale than Muhammad ibn Sinan. But they're generally on the side of trustworthiness. They're trustworthy reporters. Then after Ibrahim ibn Mundhir, and he died in the year 236. He died in the year 236. You have Muhammad, the son of Fulayh. And Muhammad died in the year 197. His grading, according to Yahya ibn Ma'in, is that he wasn't laysa bi thiqatin, he wasn't that trustworthy. Abu Hatim said, Ma bihi ba'sun laysa bi dhalika al-qawi. There's no problem taking from him, but he wasn't that strong. So again, we find these reporters are not the strongest, Muhammad and Ibrahim particularly. And then the whole problem is because of Fulay. Now, you can see Fulay is a common link between the isnads. So the reason Bukhari brings a second isnad is all because of Fulay. So who was Fulay? Fulay ibn Sulaiman. Fulay ibn Sulaiman died in the year 168. So he was a early generation hadith reporter from Medina who most experts deemed to be weak. And a couple of them accepted his transmissions. So he's kind of like Ismail ibn Abi Uwais. He's like generally hadith reporters, they liken him to Ismail ibn Abi Uwais, who was the nephew and son-in-law of Imam Malik, but not the strongest reporter of Imam Malik. So he also appears in Bukhari. Now Fulayh, so he had many, many teachers. Among his teachers were Nafi' al-Zuhri, Nu'aym al-Mujmir, and many others, Hisham ibn Urwa, and his students included people like Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. So he has great teachers and great students, but he's not the strongest reporter. So in the 6 books of Hadith, Fulayh, his reports are a primary capacity. So Fulayh is the problem here. So the specific comments about his grading. So Yahya ibn Ma'in, he says Da'if. He's a weak reporter. Okay. He also said Laysa biqawiyin wa la yuhtajju bihi. He is not that strong and he's not to be relied upon. Abu Dawud says that Yahya ibn Ma'in did not like him so much. And he say, Kana yaksha'iru min ahadith Fulayh. When Fulayh, his hadith were read, Yahya ibn Ma'in, his hair would stand up, like he would get very anxious. That's an expression of becoming anxious. So you can see from the grading, Fulayh is not a strong reporter. He's generally a weak transmitter. Daraqutni said about him, مختلفون في فليح ولا بأس به. He says it's differed about his status, but there's no problem taking from him. So now the question is, so Fulayh is a weak reporter. Generally, like that's the consensus of the hadith expert. The issue is, why is he in Bukhari? Why is he in the Sahih? And that's the first hadith of Kitab al-Ilm. So Fulayh, not such a strong reporter. Bukhari is transmitting his hadith. What do you think the reasons are? That's something to think about. When you read biographies, you'll see, oh, wait a minute, this person's not so strong. So why is Bukhari reporting from? Well, let me just quickly finish the transmitters. Hilal ibn Ali died around the year 110 or after 110. Um, Dhahabi says about thiqatun mashhurun. Nasai says laysa bihi ba's. Abu Hatim said shaykhun yuktabu hadithu. So his comments are good. He's a reliable transmitter, Hilal, generally speaking. And then he transmits from Ata ibn Yasar. Ata ibn Yasar died in the year 94 or possibly 103. Ata ibn Yasar was a Qadi of Medina. He was the freed slave of Maymuna, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. Ibn Sa'd says about him, كان ثقة كثير الحديث. Ata ibn Yasar was trustworthy and he was prolific in hadith. So Ata ibn Yasar was pretty reliable. So Ata is good. Abu Huraira is reliable. Hilal is reliable. Muhammad ibn Sinan generally is, you can say, reliable. But Fulayh, not so much. I circled him. And then Ibrahim and the son of Fulayh also are not the strongest transmitters. So now overall, you have the beginning, strong transmitter, the end, strong transmitters. So does this make, as an isnad, what would you say about this isnad? So you have strong, weak, strong, strong, strong. Does that make the isnad strong or weak? Is it a matter of numbers? Yeah. Weakest link, exactly. So if there's one link that's weak, then that's the judgment of the whole isnad. So Fulayh is a common link. So Fulayh is unanimously considered to be weak. So or not unanimous, but like the general consensus seems to be that he's weak. So this isnad is not that strong. So remember I asked you, like, think about Bukhari has two isnads here. Why does he have two isnads? There must be a reason for that. So when you have Bukhari relating two isnads, you know that there's a problem that he's trying to solve. So Bukhari here, he knows that it's a weak isnad. So he's trying to bring support for the isnad. So he's trying to bring like a second isnad that kind of supports that isnad. So so you have Muhammad ibn Sinan, he's not the strongest, but then he's supported by Ibrahim ibn al-Munzir. Now you kind of have two different people from different lands that are relating the same hadith. So generally from Bukhari to Fulayh, then the isnad becomes stronger because now you have two different sources for that isnad. But it still raises the question about Fulayh. Fulayh is generally weak, so there's no one supporting Fulayh. Um, so you have two students of his transmitting from him, but now Fulayh is weak. So generally the isnad you can say is weak. When I say weak, I don't mean da'if. I mean it's not the strongest. So now the next issue is, what is the isnad? What exactly is it? Is it sahih? Is it da'if? So I'm not making that judgment yet. I'm just trying to give you concepts. So Fulayh is a weak transmitter. So now what Bukhari and Muslim do, they are using a weak transmitter. And this isnad, you can say as an isnad, not judging the hadith, but as is isnad is kind of like a weak isnad, a weaker isnad, so to speak. So, and that's in Bukhari. So one issue could be that someone wrote it could be mutaba. So mutaba would be like a support. But then what is it supporting? This is the first hadith. The first hadith is not mutaba. Oh, just as a transmitter. He's weak. He's not the strongest transmitter. So, like, his reports aren't the strongest. He doesn't have the strongest memory. So some people generally like avoided him. And la yuhtajju bihi. Abu Dawud said that. Abu Hatim al-Razi said laysa biqawi. He's not strong. So some of them avoided him, some took from him, but mostly you can say the consensus of the experts was that he was weak. So it's not like it's a huge difference of opinion where some say he's strong, some say he's weak. It's kind of like the consensus seems to be inclining towards weakness. So Bukhari includes him. So Bukhari this is not like a supporting, it's not the prime, it's secondary corpus. It is the usul of the book. It's in it is the first hadith, so it can't be like a support. It is part of the usul. Uh-huh. What the clue? What? Oh, you think it's part of the chapter heading? Yeah, that's a possibility. So if like in the beginning, so in the chapter heading, sometimes Bukhari uses weak hadith, but according to the way the hadith is structured in like all the manuscripts, it doesn't appear to be a chapter heading. It appears to be so you can, if you look at the hadith up close, it's clearly marked Haddathana, and the hadith begins. No, so the bab, the first line is the bab, then Haddathana begins the hadith. So you can still say, okay, you know what? The manuscript person who's writing the hadith, maybe they made a mistake. It looks like a hadith, but it's part of the bab. Then you will get to the hadith. But then at the end of the hadith, it says bab. So there's no other hadith in the chapter. So if there was another hadith in the chapter, you can make an argument that this hadith is part of the chapter heading and not the chapter itself. There's no hadith afterwards, only one hadith. Yeah, it's the first bab. Well, it's the second bab of Kitab al-Ilm that we're looking at. So you can see باب من سئل علما وهو مشتغل في حديثه فأتم الحديث ثم أجاب السائل. So and then the hadith itself, and then you have the next bab. So the chapter itself has only one hadith. So it is the primary hadith in the chapter. It is not like a supporting hadith. You can't make an argument, well, it's just the second hadith, or it's a weak hadith that Bukhari brings at the end sometimes, occasionally. Um, and he considered it strong. That's your, yeah. Um, that's a possibility. So here's the thing you need to understand, that Bukhari is the strongest book of hadith. We say every hadith in Bukhari is strong and sahih, but it doesn't mean every transmitter that he's using is a strong transmitter. Sometimes he'll use weak transmitters, but the hadith itself is strong. So Bukhari will not share. So you can say the isnad has weak transmitters, but the hadith itself is sahih. That's Bukhari's judgment. The hadith is not weak. So the question arises then, why Bukhari sometimes uses weak narrators. So he does that in his book. It's not that frequent. It's infrequent, it's rare, but he does use weak transmitters in the Sahih. And we talked about this many times. So for instance, like one great case study is to look at the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Muwatta is the soundest book of hadith. And Shah Waliullah, rahimullah, he considered the Muwatta to be the source of Sunnah, and Bukhari and Muslim to be emanating from the Muwatta, like commentaries of the Muwatta. And that's kind of fairly accurate because most of the Muwatta is within the Sahih of Bukhari and Muslim. So Bukhari and Muslim, they kind of took Imam Malik's project of hadith authentication and took it, like refined it, took it to the next level. But you can say the bulk of the hadith are from the Muwatta, a huge portion of them. Um, so the Muwatta, so the Muwatta comes from who in Bukhari? Which student of Imam Malik does Bukhari take from? Mostly in the Muwatta, mostly in the Sahih rather. So Imam Malik had a lot of students or a few students? He had many. Imam Malik was one of the most famous scholars. He had tens of thousands of students. Not like 10, 20, not like 100, tens of thousands. Because people came from all over the world to study in Medina in his time. And so many people transmitted Muwatta from Imam Malik. So he had so many transmitters. And then he had a professional book. He wasn't teaching from memory. He had a book called Muwatta. People would copy that Muwatta from him, learn the hadith from him, and then take that book to various parts of the world. So, Yahya ibn Yahya al-Andalusi was his most famous student from Andalus. Because of him, he took the Muwatta, he came to study with Malik, and he took the Muwatta back to Andalus. And that is why all of Spain was Maliki, like 99.9999%. All the ulama of Andalus, like for 700 years, were Maliki because of Yahya. And then, so he had so many students, Imam Malik, all around the world that took this book and brought it back to their lands. So Bukhari takes the Muwatta from many reliable students of Malik, like Qutayba, like Abdullah ibn Yusuf at-Tinnisi, and others. But there's some students of Malik that weren't so reliable. So one of the students of Malik that's, like I mentioned in the context of Fulayh, was Ismail ibn Abi Uwais. So Ismail was his family. He was Malik's nephew, and he married Malik's daughter. So Ismail ibn Abi Uwais was the nephew and son-in-law of Imam Malik, and he's a student of Malik, and he took the Muwatta and he taught it to others. Bukhari, one of his teachers was Ismail. So Bukhari, in the story I mentioned in previous classes, Bukhari would come to Ismail and correct him. Then Ismail realized, like this guy knows, this student of mine knows, and he would ask him to correct my hadith. So after a while, he started bringing his books, and he would ask Bukhari, show me the mistakes, and Bukhari would point out the mistakes. And then Ismail would teach his books with the corrections of Imam Bukhari. So Bukhari has hadith in the Sahih from Ismail from Malik. So Bukhari relates from Ismail from Imam Malik. Ismail is not strong as a transmitter. But is that hadith he's relating from Imam Malik, is that hadith strong or not? That's the issue. So the hadith is strong. Why? Because the hadith is well known. It's part of the Muwatta. Everyone knows the Muwatta. It's like, the Muwatta comes through thousands of people. So the hadith is already well known. So sometimes Bukhari, what he does is he brings a weaker transmitter of a well-known hadith, not to show you that the hadith is weak, but just to give you hadith from a different isnad. So he brings hadith that are well-known, that are already established, sometimes from weaker transmitters. So that weaker transmitter doesn't make the hadith weak, because the hadith is already part of the Muwatta. It's a well-known book. It comes through hundreds of isnads. So that's the issue here. So Bukhari and Muslims sometimes use weak transmitters, but they don't have weak reports. So what are some of the reasons why? Because there are a number of reasons why Bukhari would do that. The question still arises: why would he do that? Why not just bring a strong transmitter? So here's a list of reasons why sometimes Bukhari uses a weaker transmitter. Number one, if the weakness could be remedied, like it could be fixed. So Bukhari would use that isnad and just fix or remedy that with another isnad or something like that. So there are many examples of like that. Like there's a well-known example of it's a hadith with a strong isnad, but it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ visited all of his wives. The issue arises: did the Prophet ever have 11 wives at one time? How many wives did he have at one time? The max 9. So that's a mistake. So that 11 is just an innocent mistake. The isnad is strong. So if you look at that hadith in Bukhari, Bukhari relates that hadith. He doesn't get rid of the hadith, but at the end of the hadith, he brings another isnad that corrects that it was 9. So when you can correct like a weakness of one of the transmitters, or a weakness of the report, then the Bukhari and Muslims sometimes they would use, because the weak transmitter is not really affecting the hadith. So that's one reason they would use like a weaker transmitter. Another reason that would allow them would be like what um, someone mentioned, that difference of opinion. Sometimes experts disagree. I believe this person's strong. I believe he's weak. So sometimes there's a difference of opinion. So sometimes there are transmitters in Bukhari. People will say, well, why is he using this weak transmitter? Maybe in his opinion, he's strong. That's not the case with Fulayh, but it's the case in some of the examples where Bukhari brings a weaker transmitter. A third reason is that often, so this is a real science. It's a three-dimensional science. Sometimes a transmitter is selectively weak. So sometimes one transmitter could be weak from certain teachers, and strong from other teachers. So, and there are many examples of that. Uh, so for instance, Ma'mar, when he relates from Zuhri, is very strong. When Ma'mar relates from people of Kufa, he's not so strong, like Qatada, Amash. So it's not the case that one person is strong or weak and we take him or leave him. You still have to look at other things, other factors. So there's some transmitters that are very strong for certain teachers, but they're weak from other teachers. So it could be a selective thing. So that's why sometimes, there's examples where, like, if you just look at every person, good, bad, strong, weak, and that's if we use them or not, that's not how hadith science works. So it's much more sophisticated science than that. Um, Fourthly, sometimes a transmitter is weak in selective circumstances. So not just from certain teachers, but so what happens, one common example is like when people get older. When people get older, they start forgetting. And sometimes they start making mistakes. And that was a huge phenomenon in hadith transmission. So hadith expert, they would kind of investigate when people are older, does he still have his stuff? Like that story of Imam Ahmad and Yahya ibn Ma'in who traveled to one of their senior teachers, Abu Nu'aym, and they wanted to test him. So they tested him with like they read hadith to him, but they would start mixing up the hadith. And then he realized after a few minutes like what was going on, and he kicked them out of his house. And so, but the reason they did that to see if he still knew his stuff. So, so sometimes some people in older age, they become less reliable. So now, you know, so now they're weak, but only when they transmit it in older age. So now you have to see the student that's relating from him. Did he get the hadith from him in his younger age, or after he was affected by senility? And number six, and the final one would be sometimes it depends on the content. And that's probably the case here. The content, what do you mean? Hmm. Yes, exactly. So sometimes a transmitter, you can take him, and even though he's weak, and relate from him in content that is not so complicated or sophisticated. Um, so for instance, like if there's a hadith that has to do with like, fiqh rulings, ahkam, that's more sensitive. So now hadith experts are looking for people who know their stuff, people who are experts, like people who are imams, not just anyone, any random transmitter. But sometimes the content is not so sensitive. So what's the content here? It's about asking questions. So here it's not a ruling. It's about asking questions. So in this, so sometimes they relax their criteria. They become less strict in certain matters. And this is where that famous debate about fada'il comes, right? Like, so many people believe, great scholars believe this, and we don't believe it's the case. But they say in the matters of fada'il, then your criteria becomes more relaxed. So that's true to some extent. It's true and it's not true at the same time. So it's not a absolute rule because fadail generally have to do with virtues and going to paradise, and that's very sensitive for people like Bukhari. But in matters like this, they're less technical, less sensitive. They don't have to do with ahkam. Then sometimes they'll accept transmitters that are not the strongest. And when they're certain that in the end, Bukhari, it's his judgment that this hadith came from the Prophet ﷺ. So in that case, he doesn't bring the strongest people in the isnad. Yeah.
Or that something that any hadith that Imam Bukhari had in his matan, aside from those in the abwab, were predicated upon being 100%, a gold chain thing or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this flies in the face of it.
No, so this hadith is 100% sahih.
No,
The hadith is sahih. It's not. So the the judgment of the hadith is based on many things. It's not is the primary thing. So like this hadith is sahih. based on this isnad and others, not just this isnad by itself. So there are probably other asanid that yeah. So like that Ismail ibn Abi Uwais, there are many hadith Imam Bukhari relates from him. Book. So when there's a book out there that's already written down, now you don't have to look at the isnad so strictly because the book is already exists. So now your case doesn't depend on those people. So that's the case here. So the Bukhari was certain that this hadith is sahih, but so hence he uses an isnad that's not the strongest isnad for a hadith that's already sahih, if that makes sense. So we still hold on to the contention that our belief that every hadith in Sahih Bukhari is strong, is sahih, but not every person in every isnad is a fully trustworthy reporter. Sometimes there are weak reporters. So sometimes you can get good information from weak, like the issue about the Shia transmitters in Bukhari and people who are like from other groups. Um, so they had problems. I mean, those people were problematic. But because they brought the truth and Bukhari was certain that they're not lying and this chain of command is established to the Prophet ﷺ, so Bukhari uses the hadith. So again, this is Bukhari. Another hadith expert might not do this. They might say, you know what, I don't want to use Fulayh. He's a weak transmitter. Let's use another isnad. But Bukhari is, we're trying to study the Sahih of Imam Bukhari here. So that's the case here. That's all I wanted to say about the isnad. But you can see, generally speaking, there's two isnads. That means something is going on. Whenever you see two isnads, that means there's some problem in the isnad that Bukhari is trying to bring another isnad for, to either to support it. So it's not going to be the strongest isnad, and it's going to have two isnads. Like, so there's a reason why Bukhari does what he does and bring additional isnad. How many isnads does he have for this hadith? He has thousands. Bukhari knew almost 1,000,000 hadith. So he has isnads, like hundreds of isnads for every hadith. But he brings what he brings just to prove certain points. Generally, he tries to bring the strongest, but sometimes he'll violate that principle. But for a hadith that is sahih, if that makes sense, the hadith is sahih. It is not a weak hadith. The hadith is strong. But the isnad itself in this hadith is not the strongest. Yes. In the Sahih, perhaps. In the Sahih is a good question. Mm. Yeah. So that's why you need to understand how isnad works. So the first issue is, like, if you want to analyze it, you want to find this hadith throughout the Sahih. And generally, a lot of hadith come 5 times, 6 times, 12 times in the Sahih, sometimes once. That's the first issue. I don't know the answer to that. Let's find this hadith in the Sahih. It might come through other reporters. That's the first issue. But the second, you don't stop there. The second issue is, let's find this hadith in Sahih Muslim and the other 6 books. Now then you can have a picture of how this hadith existed among the early muhaddithin. Then you can kind of have a sense of this hadith. Does it have many isnads or not? My sense is there are many isnads, but that's a good question for Nadim. Nadim loves looking at these things. If he's online, I'm going to give him homework. I don't. So if he didn't hear me, some of y'all reach out to him and tell him this is his homework. So Asim Khan has a question for Nadim Ramjan. He's going to be studying other versions of this hadith through other isnads. Okay, so let's look at the matan. So that's the isnad. Now let's look at the matan. So the matan itself. So first of all, the chapter, yes. His memory wasn't good. He made a lot of mistakes. So just from his biography. So he was a weak transmitter of Imam Malik. So people, when they wanted to study the Muwatta, they would come to the best students of Malik. Ismail wasn't it. He was not the best.
Bukhari might have been like, okay, for this particular thing, I kind of like did extra verification, or when he was narrating it, there was more context or something. Is that possible?
Like for this particular hadith?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for this particular hadith, most likely Bukhari did a lot of investigation, looked at all the books of Fulayh. from all the different teachers. And he doesn't narrate many hadith of Fulayh. Fulayh has thousands of hadith or hundreds of hadith, but he was certain about this hadith. So in his research, he researched this hadith from all different teachers, and he was certain this one Fulayh got right.
He wasn't at the same time as Yahya.
Ma'in, he's one generation after. Yahya ibn. So above Bukhari were Imam Ahmad, Yahya ibn Ma'in, and Ishaq ibn Rahaway, and Ali ibn al-Madini. Then Bukhari's time were Abu Hatim al-Razi, Abu Zura al-Razi. So they're kind of like they overlap, but they're slightly above him. Like he met Imam Ahmad. Like Imam Ahmad's generation was Yahya ibn Ma'in, Imam Ahmad. They were the two friends that traveled together. And then Ishaq ibn Rahaway. Bukhari met all of them, but they were among his teachers and as well as his, you can say, peers. Okay, let's continue. So the bab, what is a chapter? So now the second part of the study of the hadith, like isnad is one part. Remember I said there are three avenues we want to investigate to learn Bukhari really well. Isnad we did. Now the hadith itself, the sequence, the order. So what is a chapter? What is a book? The book is Kitabul Ilm. The first chapter was the virtue of knowledge. Now this is the second chapter. So that tells you this bab is high in the priorities for Bukhari and high in the list of priorities what he wants to teach us. This is the first real chapter after Fadl al-Ilm. So you can assume that this is something very important to Bukhari. So what is the chapter entitled? Man su'ila ilman wa huwa mushtaghilun fi hadithihi fa'atamma al-haditha thumma ajaba as-sa'ila. Whoever is asked a question while he is busy teaching, he should complete teaching and then answer the person who's asking the question. That's the title of the chapter. So just from that, let's look at the sequence. So the first chapter, Bab, was Fadl al-Ilm, the virtue of knowledge. Now the second, right after that, is about questioning. So you can see after the virtue of knowledge, now Bukhari is bringing practical examples and the implementation of knowledge. Okay, so that's the second issue. So the order. So first one is theory, second is practice. Fadl al-Ilm, virtue of knowledge. Now Bukhari wants to show you knowledge in action. So that's why he brings this second. And knowledge in action, Bukhari is showing you practical illustration. From this picture, this image, you have a teacher teaching and another person coming to ask questions, and the teacher continues teaching, then answering the question. So here you have a snapshot of what knowledge is. Knowledge is really through teaching, hadith. So a teacher teaching students. That's what knowledge is. And part of that process is questioning, questions. So questions are a very important part. Knowledge really is questions and answers. Questions are one half of knowledge. So this is very high in the list of what Bukhari wants to teach us. So you learn all of these things. This is the hadith that he brings to prove certain point, to prove what knowledge is, what knowledge looks like, what knowledge is teaching, and the idea of asking questions. And then that patience, the idea of like someone asks a question, he has to be patient to hear the answer. That's part of it too. So that person, like the Prophet continued saying what he needed to say, then he turned to the questioner who was interrupting him in the middle of his speech. So there are many, many things that we learn. So let's look at the hadith itself. So Abu Huraira relates, قال بينما النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في مجلس يحدث القوم جاءه أعرابي فقال متى الساعة. So one day the Prophet ﷺ was sitting in a majlis speaking to the people, meaning teaching them, talking to them. Perhaps it was a khutbah, perhaps it was just a maw'idah. And then جاءه أعرابي, a Bedouin Arab came to him, and he said to him, Mata Sa', when is the day of judgment? So a random person comes in the middle of the majlis. The Prophet is in the middle of a majlis, speaking, teaching, and he comes, when is the day of judgment? So this is The Arabi, who were they? The Bedouins. They were people who weren't mannered. They were living in the outskirts of civilization. So they generally had this rough and tough, like kind of demeanor to them. So when they came and interacted with the Prophet, you find that in many of the interactions. Now, the rest of the companions, they loved whenever a Bedouin came. Why? Because the companions had adab. They weren't bothering the Prophet all the time. They weren't asking detailed questions. So when a simpleton comes and asks questions, they loved it because they would get answers. Sometimes when you're studying with the teacher, you have a dumb question that comes to your mind, right? But you're afraid to ask because you have adab. But then someone comes and asks, you get so happy, man, that guy asked for me. Like I was afraid to ask, I didn't want to expose myself. So that's how it was with the Bedouins, like for many of these gatherings. So they were straightforward, they were blunt, they would get right to the meat of the question, and sometimes they wouldn't wait. They didn't have the adab or the patience to sit down and wait. So the person said, Mata sa'a. فَمَضَى رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ يُحَدِّثُ. So the Prophet continued, Mada, speaking. So he didn't stop. He continued saying what he needed to say, teaching what he wanted to teach. So he didn't interrupt himself from that. فقال بعض القوم سمع ما قال فكره. So some of the people in the audience started saying he heard him and he didn't like what he had to say or the demeanor. فكره ما قال. وقال بعضهم بل لم يسمع. And some of them said, you know what, maybe he didn't hear him. So like he was on the outside of the audience. So people started debating. Maybe the Prophet didn't hear him. That's why he's ignoring him. And some of them said, no, he heard him, but he didn't like what he heard. Um, حتى إذا قضى حديثه, until قضى, like transpired or passed, until the Prophet's address was finished. قضى حديثه. قال أين أراه السائل. He asked, where is the questioner? أين السائل. The question was أين السائل. أراه أين السائل عن الساعة. Where is the questioner about the Day of Judgment? The word أراه here is an interjection from one of the transmitters. Doesn't make sense. أين أراه السائل. So the commentators, they say it probably comes from Muhammad ibn Fulayh, one of the transmitters. So he says, I saw, or I think that he said the questioner. So he asks, where is the question? أين السائل? That's the question. عن الساعة. قال ها أنا يا رسول الله. So that person came forward. He said, here I am, O Messenger of Allah. Then the Prophet gave him the answer. قال إذا ضيعت الأمانة فانتظر الساعة. When the amana, the trust is betrayed, then wait for the Day of Judgment. So this man came and he wanted to know when is the Day of Judgment. He was looking for a date. He was looking for a time. So the Prophet answered, إذا ضيعت الأمانة فانتظر الساعة. When the responsibilities and the trusts are betrayed, then the Day of Judgment is about to come. Then you should wait for the Day of Judgment. Then the man asked, قال كيف إضاعتها. How is the trust betrayed or destroyed or wasted? قال إذا وسد الأمر إلى غير أهله فانتظر الساعة. He says when the matter is entrusted to those who don't deserve it, those who aren't worthy of it, then wait for the Day of Judgment. So, first of all, the matan, what does that mean? It's self-obvious, the meaning, that the idea of amana and trust, that's so important in the deen. Everyone has responsibilities in whatever scope and position you find yourself in. You have a responsibility to the The Prophet said in another hadith, every one of you is a shepherd and every one of you is responsible, mas'ul an ra'iyati, about whom you're responsible for. So when those trusts are betrayed, that responsibility is betrayed or wasted, then that's a sign of the Day of Judgment. And when the man wanted more details, the Prophet said, when leadership is entrusted to someone who doesn't deserve it, then wait for the Day of Judgment. So this amr is a broad term for leadership. It could be leadership in various things. It could be like a person who becomes a teacher and he's not worthy of teaching. It could be a person responsible for something like specific and he's not worthy of it. And it could be the leader of the salah, the imam of the leaders of the Muslims or the lands. When they're not worthy, then wait for the day of judgment. So that is very strong, indictment of leadership. Like when leadership is wasted, and that is certainly the case today. You have leaders in various positions, starting with the political leaders that don't deserve it. They're not the best of the people. They're غير أهله. They're not people who are like, the ahl for that. They're not worthy of that. So that's a matter of the day of judgment. So that's the sign of the day of judgment. These are negative qualities. So this is the matan of the hadith. So you talked about who the Bedouins were. We learned so many things. You can sit down and we can just discuss and we can open the floor. What are the lessons we can take from this hadith? What are some things um, that you can take from this hadith? If you had to list, like some of the lessons, what are they like from this particular interaction and exchange? Let's just do a quick lesson. Let's just go around. Yeah.
Told that a lot of ourselves were getting involved in talking to Sahaba and teaching them, they would feel free, I guess, to like not cut them off, but ask questions during the lecture because they weren't surprised by the veterans.
Yes. Yes.
That they didn't answer them right away.
Yes. So sometimes that means sometimes the prophet didn't answer right away. So like the people were surprised maybe he didn't hear him. The fact that people said that, that means this wasn't that rare. So the prophet would tend, so you can learn from there that the prophet generally he took his responsibility as a messenger seriously. When people asked questions, he would answer them. And when he didn't know the answer, he would be silent and then Allah would give the answer. That's why in the Quran, yes, alunaka an. How many times the Quran comes? They ask you about such and such. And the Prophet didn't know the answer, Allah would reveal it to him. So he took his responsibility seriously. So that's one thing we learned. Like so the content itself is responsibility when it's wasted. And the Prophet certainly is not a person who wasted his he took it seriously and he fulfilled it in the best manner possible. Um, so he took questioning seriously, the Prophet. Um, what else?
Then they must not, if he is interrupted, he will just continue, and when he is done, he can respond. Because, subhanAllah, the kids now, they are doing that.
Yes.
They are just interrupting, and then if the teacher is going, sometimes I'm doing it, I'm just replying, and then finally I understood what I will be doing. But I mean that this is a role model that I will follow Prophet
So, yeah, exactly. So the Prophet, you see, he was patient too. Like he didn't correct him, he didn't get angry. He just continued teaching. So when you teach, sometimes you have to have a lot of patience. Like this questioner needs to have patience to wait for the answer, but the teacher also needs to have patience. And because when you teach, there's so many people um they will annoy the heck out of you. A month ago we were in a khutbah with Sheikh Akram when he was in town in Indiana. So this guy got up in the middle of his khutbah. He was giving the khutbah, and I'm sitting there. The Sheikh giving khutbah, and he said, "What's your proof for that?" Like in the middle of a Jummah khutbah, not a talk. So he kept, so he interrupted him in the middle of the khutbah, and then Sheikh Akram was patient, and um, then he actually answered him. He started giving him some verses, and he wasn't happy. So the guy he kept asking questions. Like, so he probably had a mental problem, obviously, but he just interrupted in the middle of the khutbah multiple times. And then some people made him stop talking. So he did answer him during the khutbah. And then, no, but so somebody needs to tell that brother. But people don't follow all the rules. It could be a mental issue and things like that. So then afterwards, he came Shaykh Akram came to him after the khutbah and he said, like, so he was upset about something he said, and he said, what you're doing is like shirk. He called him a mushrik. And then Shaykh Akram said, okay, just make dua for me. He said, I don't make dua for mushriks. So you deal with these types of people all the time. That happens. I mean, Shaykh Akram wasn't angry. We knew that he probably had mental issues, but these kind of things happen. So there's a lot we can learn from this hadith, that you have to be patient, keep teaching, don't interrupt the whole thing, because now when the teacher is teaching, that is a priority, like whatever he's teaching the students. No one should come and interrupt that, because it's like interrupting something that's ongoing. So the adab is, you need to finish what you're doing and then you get to that person. So there's a lot of patience and tact that is required here. So yeah, what else can you learn?
Prophet asked him the question, but this question probably wasn't related to him.
Hmm.
So if it was one of his Sahaba certain friends that didn't come in, then perhaps Prophet would say right away with his related question. But the Prophet is also teaching mannerism that in a while Prophet is going, Prophet is speaking, don't ask for relevant things.
Yeah.
Prophet actually did answer, fortunately.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the things the brother mentioned, is the question was not relevant to whatever he was talking about. So the Prophet is teaching a lesson. One is, don't interrupt, generally, whether it's relevant or not. But second, if you're talking about a topic and something irrelevant comes up, you should like continue the topic instead of getting derailed. So the adab is to continue what you're speaking about and not go on a tangent. Um, and the Prophet did that. He was teaching people. He was just silent. He continued speaking. That's a great lesson. One thing is, you could just scold that person. What do you think you're doing? Like, but just continuing to teach, ignoring that person, is sending a lesson in a more like polite way, and it shows adab on the part of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well.
After the final one, at the same time, allow them to ask the question if it belongs to that lecture or to the outside. I see also beauty in that.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
More like paid registration classes, and where they had access and you had to get into the class, you have to find someone to bring you there, and like it's open to anyone could walk in and ask the Prophet ﷺ the questions, and even in the middle. So it wasn't like the doors closed, now you have to wait till the class is over. It was just open. So the openness of his gathering is something amazing. um, and it had to be that way. He's a messenger for the ummah, but we should learn from that and we should try to emulate some of that. Yes, for us.
I think on top of that, said manners that even they were rude, interrupting conversation, just randomly asking a question out of nowhere. But after that, while he was going through the motion of teaching, he was still paying attention to this person. And after he was done with that, he went to look for him. Where is this person? I want to answer him. So that also shows a higher level of adab, where he was still not ignoring him completely, or he was very interruptive and accepting.
Yeah, so the Prophet took his amana seriously. He actively sought out that person so that he could answer his question. It just wasn't the right time. Um, so what did the Prophet not like about him interrupting? Like, was it the interruption or the question? So scholars debate that. So kariha ma qal, when it says that, what is about that the Prophet did not like? So one possibility is the interruption. Obviously, no teacher would like being interrupted in the middle of your statement. But the other thing that scholars say is like questions about the day of judgment. Those kind of questions the Prophet did not like. Like when is it? Like the exact time, because it's they're not useful. They're not like they don't have to do with anything. Um, like so questions like that, like specific details that are irrelevant to anything the Prophet did not like, especially about the day of judgment. So you can see he flipped the answer. Instead of giving him, he started giving them practical things to look at, things that are important. When you lose them, then the day of judgment is close. Yeah.
I think where he respond by saying like, what have you prepared for?
Yeah, it's another version where he so flipped the question of what have you prepared for it. You had a question, brother? Yeah. Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah.
That's irrelevant when it is. It's what you have done.
Hmm.
So, one thing I don't understand is, it says here that the Prophet continued his talks, and then some of the Sahaba were like, oh, he didn't hear him, or did you see what he did? But he didn't like the question. And they were talking to each other during
Yes.
it was more like, it feels like what I'm saying, it feels like it was a more relaxed.
So it probably wasn't a Jummah khutbah. That's what it looks like. Based on that, it could have been a Jummah. But it could be some people are new Muslims. They don't know these things, right? That happens a lot. Like people are embracing Islam every day. So yeah, that's what he's saying. Like that. So it likely wasn't a Jummah khutbah. It probably was just a hadith. Because it doesn't say fi khutbatihi, like the yuhaddithul qawm. The Prophet was speaking to the people. So it seems more likely it wasn't Jummah. Because then it would be yakhtub or like, a different, or he would be on the mimbar or something like that. Uh, yes, brother.
So I see that Hadith is more explicit talking about knowledge,
Hmm.
but the one of the implicit benefit what I see is more basically looking at the impact, right? So I'm talking to hundreds of people,
Hmm.
and they are engaged, okay, and at the same time one person is talking. So I'm seeing, okay, 100 people here. Okay, I don't want to disturb them. I see more impact over there. Okay,
Hmm.
rather than I'm thinking. So in day-to-day life also, whenever we do anything, I need to do the same evaluation of the family. So okay, like, I'm doing okay. This more impactful, this is less impactful, and basically accordingly giving the time, right? Not basically so as he did, that's another kind of a message here.
Yeah, good. That's a good point. Like when someone's speaking to like, let's say there's 100 people, and then there's one person that requires something. So like the 100 takes precedence over the one. So the Prophet is having them in mind. Had he interrupted himself, is taking away from those other people. So the priority there are so there are two priorities there. One is the greater number over the lesser number. That's another one priority. But the other priority is an ongoing speech. You're in the middle of something. That's a also priority, whether it's less people or not. So yeah, alhamdulillah, that's a good point. Afroz.
How was the interaction when Maktoum came and asked him? Was it also like he was talking to somebody and then came in?
Surah Abasa, you're talking about that incident? Yeah, that incident is probably a little more complicated because he was blind. So he probably didn't realize he was speaking to someone, and then he came and he asked the Prophet questions. The Prophet didn't ignore, he just it's the frowning part, like the showed displeasure on his face, um, which is a slight thing that happened, a lapse that happened on his part, which the Prophet with Allah corrected. So it's probably similar, like it's a similar concept. It was innocent on his part. Wallahu a'lam.
This guy.
Yeah. Um,
No,
mhm.
know what he was talking about. That's what the prophet talking, what was the prophet? Like he had to complete and hopefully maybe for some other hadith.
Yeah. The main topic's not there, yes. So I mean, the transmitters like Abu Hurairah, they remember certain things. All of us remember, like I remember that khutbah, the incident I told you about, like the Shaykh Akram being called a mushrik. I,
Mm.
I don't remember his his khutbah that much. I remember the topic, but I don't observe the deen. So we're confident that what we need to know has been preserved. But there are many hadith where the transmitter said the Prophet mentioned three things, and they only mentioned two, and they forgot the third, or that happens a lot. So, but now, so the final thing, like tie this with Bukhari, like I want you to have a running outline of Bukhari's teachings in this chapter. The first thing was the virtue of knowledge. Second thing is that knowledge comes from questioning and requires discipline and patience. And the amana part, if we could tie that in there, like you think that has nothing to do with, of course, knowledge is an amana. It's a trust. So you need to learn it properly, and when you teach it, it has to be taught properly. So the sense of responsibility, that's part of knowledge, and then that sense of responsibility. Yeah, exactly. Al amana. So that is very very important. And then the next hadith, which I thought we would do today, but we're not. You can see. Let's just look at the title. Bab man rafa'a sawtahu bil ilm. The one who raised his voice for knowledge. So now he's going into another technique. Sometimes, in some circumstances, you have to raise your voice, and we'll look at a remarkable hadith in that regard. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Any final questions?
Yeah, last one we're gonna go 1 hour long.
Yeah. You want it longer or shorter?
Usually 2 hours, right?
Yeah, I got to build up my endurance again. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, let's stop here. So, هذا وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى